Hi, Ron.
Hi, Robert. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. And you're Ron Kampeas. You're the Washington Bureau Chief for JTA, which stands for Jewish Telegraphic Agency. And as that name suggests, it's been around for more than a century.
Yes.
You have not been around for more than a century. However, you have for a long time been covering politics related to Israel, among other things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're going to talk about today. And I appreciate you taking the time. I tell you, I had the idea for this conversation. Yesterday, I taped a conversation with a Palestinian activist on the West Bank named Fadi Karan. And he was saying he thought that comparing this, the current conflict, to the 2014 conflict, he thinks something has changed on the Palestinian side. And he was talking about a kind of a more unified Palestinian consciousness. So we can get into what he was talking about. But that led me to want to ask you about how you think this is being processed, first of all, in Israel, and if you see much contrast there this time as compared to last. And then maybe we can get into how it's being processed in the United States a little, in the American public opinion and in the American political system. But for starters, do you just have any observations you want to articulate in general to this whole thing?
Well, the most obvious one is that the conflict is inside Israel as well, or at least what was at first. I'm not sure if that's tapering down, to what degree it's tapering down. And I called my uncle yesterday. Maybe this is the best way to explain it. And he's 95. He lives up north. There had been, and I was in touch with my relatives in the other parts of the country, and they were doing fine, even though they were in shelters. But I'd heard that there were rockets coming from Lebanon. I just wanted to know that he was okay. And he was. He says that nobody's been asked to be put in shelters there. And we chatted, and he says, we're resilient. This isn't going to affect us. Don't worry. And then I said, well, what about Akko, which is where he lives? Not where he lives. It's near where he lives. And it's a Jewish Arab city. And he said, that's a wound that's going to take a long time to heal. That is terrible. That the wound of Jews and Arabs in street fights in places like Akko and Lod and Jaffa and Haifa. He said it, yeah, and I think I understand that. That hasn't happened. I've never heard of that happening. My time covering Israel, the 15 years I lived in Israel, there was discrete intermittent reports of an attack on Jews who happened to drive in al-Fahim, or an attack on Arab Israelis who happened to be in Tel Aviv or in Netanya or something like that. But not this simultaneous rush of attacks from both sides. I'm not sure who's doing more. I don't think that's really the point of I'm trying to make. The fact that they're happening is just very, very unsettling to at least to Israeli Jews. I'm sure to Israeli Arabs as well. I know to Israeli Arabs. I just haven't spoken with them personally yet, but I have friends who are speaking to them, who are reporting on them, and that's hugely, hugely unsettling because. As somebody put it, actually I have, what am I talking about? I did a report on this. I spoke to Israeli Arabs, and as somebody put it, there was a year of a pandemic that really brought a lot of the idea of equity between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs into the narrative because of if you've ever been in an Israeli hospital, and I don't recommend getting injured in Israel, which is what I did, to go into an Israeli hospital. You see it as an oasis of equity. They treat each other as equals. It's so unique within that oasis, the relationships that don't exist. And suddenly those relationships of first responders, of hospital workers were pushed to the forefront and they were on TV. And somebody might have been explaining the pandemic in Hebrew, and how to deal with the pandemic. And they might have had that slight Arab accent that you have when you're an Arab Israeli and you speak Hebrew. And it meant a lot, and suddenly that was shattered. I mean, the people who do coexistence or shared society talk in Israel say that was shattered. So I think that's the big difference here. How do you cope with that?
So can I interject and make sure I understand? So the sense of equity you were saying had existed in healthcare centers, I would assume was equity between Arab Israelis living in Israel proper and Jewish Israelis. My understanding of the inequity on the vaccine front, at least, had been between Israelis, and I assumed both Jewish and Arab Israelis on the one hand, and Palestinians in the West Bank on the other, who were getting almost no vaccines.
Right.
I mean, in terms of the distribution of the vaccine, that is the big difference. But is the idea partly that this had really entered the consciousness of Palestinians, Palestinian Israelis living in Israel?
Yeah, I think it had. I mean, I think there was a degree of complaining because it's kind of like it's a wrinkle inside a wrinkle in the sense that the Palestinian citizens of Israel were, like the ultra-Orthodox, one of the most vaccine skeptical groups. And there was complaining from leaders within that community that the Israeli authorities were not working as hard to dispel the skepticism among Palestinian Israelis as they were among ultra-Orthodox Israelis. But it was the vaccines were no less available to the Arab Israelis than they were to the Jewish Israelis. So that was the one kind of wrinkle. But otherwise, yeah, certainly there was anger that the Israelis were not, the Israeli government side was not as proactive as it could have been in terms of getting the vaccine to the Palestinians. The Israelis said that the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian government was resistant. And then the Palestinian government said it wasn't resistant. But that was certainly an issue there for sure. So yeah, when I talk about equity, I'm definitely talking about what Arab Israelis and those Jewish Israelis who are invested in this issue have long cared about, which is trying to get some kind of equity going between the Arab and Jewish Israelis. And one thing I hadn't been aware of until now, and this came up in Israeli reporting, I go there about like every 18 months, and I hadn't heard about this, was that just as there have been, the Jewish settlement movement going into the West Bank and encroaching on Palestinian areas, and the same thing happened in Eastern Jerusalem, there is a movement, an initiative to kind of move into the Arab neighbors of Jewish Arab cities and Arab neighborhoods of Jewish Arab cities, and try and make those neighborhoods more Jewish. And that apparently has been stoking tensions. It's not something I was aware of. It's especially true in Lod, the city that's near Tel Aviv, near the airport, and Ramla, I think. And that has been an exacerbator as well. The other big exacerbator is that, it's interesting when you compare what's going on here in African American communities. Arab Israeli communities complain that they're not policed enough, that the police write them off. And there's a great deal of intercommunal violence or intracommunal violence there among Arab Israelis. There's a lot of gendered violence that they feel that the police is just ignoring, not dealing with. They want to block them off. They want to forget about them. And that has been a problem. And that's also been an exacerbator, I think, of a sense of marginalizations among over the years among some Arab Israelis. And like I said, the pandemic had gone some way towards sort of saying, hey, this is a different path that we can go down. And now you have this breakout of violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. When I was talking to Fadi yesterday, I mean, first of all, when he talked about the more unified Palestinian consciousness, he was saying that both Palestinians in Israel proper and in the West Bank seemed more engaged in the reaction against Israel's role in the Israel-Gaza conflict. He mentioned, for one thing, a one-day strike that happened yesterday,
right?
Which was apparently had a pretty big impact both in the West Bank and in Israel, where Arab shopkeepers closed their shops and so on. But I think he also probably was referring to what you mentioned, the kind of civil conflict in Israel reflects, a certain kind of passion on both sides. Probably, maybe passion is too kind a word, but it reflects a degree of a kind of engagement in the issue. And when I ask him, well, why, if things are suddenly different and there is this more unified Palestinian consciousness, What do you think the big issue? Well, why is it? And I think the first thing he mentioned was the pandemic, was COVID, in the sense that he's living in the West Bank and maybe speaking largely from that perspective. But apparently the disparity in just the availability of vaccines between Israel proper and the West Bank had a big impact on Palestinian opinion. I'm kind of wondering whether in Israel, that gets. I wonder whether that was part of the discussion before. Like, were there many Israelis saying, in the long run, it's just not good to make them hate us more, right? I mean, I have no idea whether that is. I know there were some Israelis arguing for making vaccines more available, and I'm sure some were doing it on sheer health grounds, right? It's like these diseases are contagious; they live pretty close.
Right.
But do you have any sense for? I mean, there's a larger issue here that has to do with whether Israelis are going to process this conflict as a victory or a setback. And the larger issue is, to what extent do they think of hatred among Palestinians, A, as a problem, and B, as something they can control much, that they can exert much influence on?
So I think one of the successes of the right wing since the Second Intifada has been limiting contact with Israelis, in terms of between Palestinians and Israelis, which allows Israelis to forget about this, 2-3 million plus population. That's, not even talking about the Israeli Arabs, but I'm talking about Palestinians.
Well, the separation barrier, the wall, has had something to do with that, right?
A separation barrier, absolutely. I think also I was in 1989, before I joined the army, I joined the army in late 1988, the first Intifada had broken out, and it was an Intifada that was controlled by a civilian army, by people who were in the reserves, and you were facing it every day, and you were bringing home the stories. And, there were people, it depends on your personality, there were people who were bringing stories home about hating the Palestinians, and there were people bringing stories home about understanding the Palestinians. And what I found fascinating when I was in the army is that your political party didn't color that division. I was talking to right-wing people who were saying, if I were in their situation, I would be doing the same thing at the time. And I think that what happened is that the army, to a degree, partly because of the separation wall, and partly because of a mechanization of how the army works, partly because of, better intelligence techniques. There's just fewer encounters like that between Israelis and Palestinians. So a lot of Israelis had forgotten about this. And this serves as a big reminder that they're there. I don't know how that plays out. Does that play out in more, in advocacy for more restrictive measures towards the Palestinians, or does that play out in we can no longer not deal with this? I mean, there's a whole generation has arisen, that wasn't as traumatized by the Second Intifada as a generation who lived through it was. Because remember, the Second Intifada shifted from dealing with Israeli soldiers who were in the territories to attacking civilians who were within the Green Line. I mean, there was a little bit of that in the first Intifada.
And we should be clear, the Intifada you were referring to earlier was largely about rock throwing on the West Bank.
Right.
The Second Intifada, which is remembered much more traumatically by Israelis who remember it, involved suicide bombs in Israel proper. Right. That started around 2001.
Right.
And so now you're saying, so this younger generation of, because, I want to get around to discussing the generational change in American Jewish attitudes, but elaborate on that. So Israeli Jews who are too young to remember the Second Intifada, how does that influence their view of this?
Well, we don't know yet. I mean, the truth is that the polling shows that they're more right wing, but that's because the left wing in Israel has kind of disappeared after the Second Intifada, and the left wing in Israel, to the degree that it embraced, to the degree that it surged in popularity and in attention, had to do with domestic issue, like the housing crisis in Tel Aviv in 2011, and there were strikes for the housing crisis, and it actually elevated some left wingers. Now, I don't know to the degree to which that shifts in any way their direction because of this outburst. There's a kind of a myth, I think, playing out. I've seen a little bit. I've seen on social media that Israelis aren't seeing the destruction in Gaza. Actually, they are. I've watched the coverage. There is a big dialogue going on in Israeli media about the repercussions of the airstrikes on Gaza and what that's doing to Palestinians. And interestingly, what's playing out is that the Israeli media is bringing into the studios Israeli Palestinians, Arab Israelis, to talk about that and talk about how they feel about that. And it's led to some very, very raw, even for Israeli television, which is always kind of raw, very raw encounters between Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis who are saying, I can't stop thinking about being a Palestinian right now. And you're getting pushback. You're getting people, you're not getting the moderators say, at least in what I've seen, the moderators aren't saying this, but the other side is saying, well, that makes you a traitor if you're identifying with the Palestinian side. And the Arab Israelis saying, these are my people. I can't not identify them and with their suffering. So it is entering the Israeli consciousness. And I don't know what degree to which that affects people who haven't been traumatized by the attacks on civilians of the that happened during the 2000s. Young people who have, I don't know how it affects people who have processed that. And like I said, it might drive them to be more hawkish, less accommodating, or it might, or the scenes of the devastation in the Gaza Strip, the claims of the Palestinians, the reluctance to identify. I mean, there have been filming. There was the night I watched. There was the Israeli government broadcaster called Khan. In this encounter, kept on showing on a loop the pictures of the Jewish Israelis in Bat Yam dragging an Arab driver out of his car and beating him unconscious. And there was, you could see that the Jewish anchors were appalled by that action. You could see that coming across to a degree, even amongst extreme right-wing politicians who reacted to the footage, who were appalled by it. Is that the thing that's going to linger in their mind? Is the child who was near Gaza, the Jewish child who was near Gaza who was killed, is that going to linger in their mind? Is it going to be a meld, or what kind of conversation going forward? I'm not sure is what happens, but it's certainly, they're not blocking it from their consciousness, at least right now. The Palestinian narrative, at least, they're
I think
grappling with it. Isn't
it a source of deep concern among a lot of Israeli Jews that this could be a sign of things to come? I mean, I would even think it might influence kind of the decision-making paradigm next time Israel is deciding whether to launch an assault on Gaza. I mean, it's got to factor in on the cost side, because I think, as you said, there's nobody anywhere along the Israeli political spectrum that thinks it would be good for their interests, for there to be ongoing civil strife in Israel, right? Or who thinks it would be good for Israel broadly. I mean,
I think there are people on the extreme right who would think that, but otherwise, even, maybe like the extreme right has sort of degrees. And so, you had this alignment of very far right-wing parties that Netanyahu made peace with before the elections in order to have a vote exchange thing, and that caused all sorts of consternation overseas and within Israel. But even within that constellation, there's like the guy named Bezalel Smotrich who put out the statement saying, this is not me, talking about the Arab who was beaten in Bat Yam, this is bad. But then there is like another party that's even further to his right, who's part of that little constellation. They are aficionados of Kach, the Meir Kahane. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure they wouldn't be too unhappy with this because part of Kahane's thing is like all radicals. He wanted to stoke division. He wanted to stoke hatreds, and so they might be okay with this. But you're right. I think aside from that, across the spectrum, nobody wants this to continue.
Yeah. So the conventional wisdom is kind of that. As a political matter, this has helped Netanyahu. He was, of course, in a precarious situation. He couldn't manage to assemble a coalition, and they kept, trying things, having new elections. I guess I haven't been keeping track, but I know he had not managed to consolidate his role, and ensure that he would remain prime minister. And of course, he has a deepened incentive to do so by virtue of the fact that if he doesn't, he may wind up in jail because he's being prosecuted. I guess oddly, he's actually being prosecuted while in office, but he won't go to prison if he's in office or something like that. I didn't understand it exactly, but
if he's convicted, he'll go to prison.
He will, even as prime minister?
Yes, he can't. He's trying to get the law changed, so he can't. But as the law currently stands, he'll go to jail if he's convicted he'll have to leave office in any case, whether or not he goes to jail.
Do you agree with people who say this has been good for him politically, and now he, leaving aside the prosecution, this increases the chances that he can remain prime minister for some time to come?
I don't know. I think that it's a complicated question because one of the reasons that he is popular in times of conflict is that he's able to actually stem the conflict. So if he actually pulls this off and he manages to make it look like a win, it's good for him, and especially if they go to a fifth round of elections in 2 years, and then he has that to build on. The problem, the paradox for him is that he has to, if he wants to draw things out, I forget how many more days or weeks that Yair Lapid has to form a government. Then he has to drag it out, and then that paradoxically makes him look like he's not able to control the conflict. The thing about Netanyahu that Israelis actually do understand, people, is he is traditionally quite cautious. He tried to wrap up the 2014 and 2012 wars very quickly. He says he's not talking to Hamas. Essentially did talk to Hamas in ways that maybe people to his left in the prime ministership might have not have been as confident enough to do, and he brought it to an end. So that that's the paradox. Now he can bring it to an end quickly, but then he goes back into a situation in which he's vulnerable. If he can drag it out, but then he's made to look as if he's a warmonger even among Israelis. So I don't know how he deals with that. That's interesting. But for now, it's actually better news in the sense, yes, that there are right-wing parties. And there was an Arab party that they were willing to live together just in order to oust Netanyahu. That's less viable now for right-wing leaders in Israel, and it's also less viable for Mansour Abbas, the leader of Amman, the Arab party, because of what's going on.
But in any event, I assume the great bulk of Jewish Israeli opinion holds that the response, which is considered disproportionate in a lot of parts of the world, is fully justified. The ongoing kind of assault on Gaza.
I think so far, yes. I think that once they start picking through there might be more dissent once they start picking through the details of what went on. But Israelis definitely see this as separate from the ostensible trigger for Hamas, which was the tensions in Jerusalem. There's no way. I don't think that there are very many Israelis who would rationalize Hamas launching rockets inside Israel and areas of the country that have nothing to do with Jerusalem on civilians, killing civilians, as a justifiable reaction to the whole business in Jerusalem, which we haven't discussed yet. But whereas I think that if you look at the narrative that people are talking about, people who are critical of Israel, they do see that. They do start with Jerusalem and go to Hamas firing rockets, and then Israel reacting disproportionately or not. But that's not something Israelis understand or want to understand, and they there's I can see why, because it's just one thing's happening here, and there is a protest, and you saw, in fact, there was a brief moment after Hamas started firing rockets that the Palestinians who were protesting in Jerusalem were very, very upset with Hamas, because they said, now you've, whatever moral and political momentum we had with our protests in Jerusalem, that's gone. So I think Israelis would tend to see that the same way.
So in America, you've had some traditionally, very pro-Israel commentators. Like, I think Max Boot say, not say, well, the Hamas was justified in firing the rockets, but I think suggesting, I'm not sure he said exactly this, but saying that it should have been predictable that when, for example, you send police into Al-Aqsa Mosque firing rubber bullets, that's probably going to be a red line for Hamas. They're probably going to have to fire some missiles, either feeling the political pressure at the grassroots level or wanting to take advantage of it politically. But for whatever reason, that should have been predictable. That's more what I'm hearing from some corners in America, leaving aside who's justified in doing what.
Yeah, I think that's, I think that will be that could be the case in Israel as well. And there are people who are talking, I think you posted the other day an interview you did with Danny Seideman, who's one of the smartest people on Jerusalem. And, the way he puts it is, Jerusalem's a detonator, but the bomb always can go off elsewhere. Sometimes it actually goes off in Jerusalem, but, this time, Jerusalem was a detonator. And absolutely, I think that I just don't know to what degree that the Israelis, Jewish Israelis will see it, but there was certainly massive clumsiness going on, in Jerusalem with just raiding the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the whole business of cutting off the speakers because the Israeli president was addressing Israelis at the Western Wall on Memorial Day. It's just, those are the things people when you talk about the Western Wall and you talk about the Haram al-Sharif, the Muslim holy area, also known as a Temple Mount that overlooks the Western Wall, you throw rationalization out of the window. And it's just, those kinds of pictures, are definitely a trigger. And they're going to bring out irrational responses. I mean, what I was talking about was, I think that there might be repercussions among Israelis. We'll see in terms of Netanyahu getting into bed with extremists, looking the other way as extremists did what they did in Jerusalem. But it might be harder, I think, for Israelis to regard the reaction to the rocket fire is disproportionate, simply because it's driving them into shelters. The numbers are obviously hugely different. You're talking about over 200 people now, right? I think it's close to 300 dead on the Palestinian side and 12 dead on the Israeli side. But still, they see the threat. They want their government to react to it.
Mm-hmm. So, do you have any sense for? I mean, this will ultimately factor into what we're talking about, but how the world's reaction, including the reaction in America, how that is factoring into how Israelis, and especially Jewish Israelis, process this whole thing. Because at least in America, some people are noting that things seem to be changing. Younger Jews are not so pro-Israel in the way that maybe their parents were. On average, many are, but still there is this shift. You have these young groups like, if not now, these groups of young progressives very active online. There was an article today about how some teens, I think, like high school students, and these were not all Jewish, but still it's significant, I think, who had helped Ed Markey get elected. They were like his grassroots gang because they were very aware of his pro-environmental positions. And then only in the last few days, they found out that he says, about Israel, the kinds of things most American politicians say, which is like Israel has a right to defend itself. And they've gotten all upset. There are a number of indicators that in America there may be change, including within the realm of Jewish opinion as the generations pass. And then they're not unrelated things like the Human Rights Watch report saying Israel is guilty of apartheid. I'm sure you remember that, 15 years or so ago when Jimmy Carter came out with a book, I think kind of just saying, not so much saying Israel was guilty of apartheid, right, but that it should make sure it doesn't get to apartheid.
Right.
He had to walk that back just for using the word.
He called me.
Did he? Jimmy Carter? He called you for what? I got a call saying,
this is Jimmy Carter's secretary. He's on the line. He wants to talk to you. He wanted to talk about repentance for using that word.
Well, I mean, he's Protestant, so he didn't have a priest he could go to for confession. I guess that was your job.
Right,
Did he also want you to, he was hoping you would write about it probably,
yeah,
right?
No, I think basically the story was Abe Foxman. He reached out to Abe Foxman and said, best do this through the media. I think you should do it through JTA. Here's Ron Kampeas. It was like Christmas holiday, so nobody was at home except for me, working. And so I got a call, this is Jimmy Carter. And so, yeah, he wanted to say that he regretted using the term because he thought maybe it was premature. But you're absolutely right. He wasn't even talking about Israel being in apartheid, having apartheid. He was talking about the dangers. He was saying as former American president what Ehud Barak had said in 1999, and others have said that there's a danger that we could become apartheid, get into an apartheid situation. Except for some reason, it's kosher for Israelis to say it. Not kosher. Never understood.
But now suddenly it's kosher for Americans. I mean, you're seeing it said in the Washington Post and the New York Times. Is it Bet Salem? I don't know how you pronounce the name of the Israeli human rights organization. Is saying it. So there is, and all of the other thing that's happening is, I think, within the Palestinian community, certainly, is less and less discussion of a two-state solution, more discussion of a one-state solution, which Israelis, don't even want to talk about. So there are these changes, at least on the American side. I didn't know to what extent there's change, say, in Europe, which has always been less pro-Israel than America. But do you get the sense that Israelis are cognizant of this and concerned about it?
Oh, absolutely. I think, yeah, for sure. I mean, the one thing I would tell you, you mentioned like young Jewish groups, like If Not Now, that doesn't register as much. I think, that one of the things, the saddest things that have gone on is like the Israelis have cared less about diaspora. When the leadership is concerned about it, they actually set up a diaspora ministry. There's a fascinating woman, an ultra-Orthodox woman named Omer Yankelevich, who is a diaspora minister. She wants more Israel diaspora interaction. I'm interviewing her on Monday about that. That's a separate thing. But just to get back to your point, absolutely. They are, if you at least a talking heads class. And from my visits, the street class as well, the Israelis in the street, the Israelis, everybody is very cognizant of American support for Israel and how important it is. And the news they're getting, which I'm hearing like when I listen to Israel radio or watch Israel TV here, is about how Democrats particularly are growing away, from their traditional pro-Israel posture. I think that the Israelis see that the squad as being much more influential than it is, but they also see that pressure. So that, they talk a lot about the squad in Israel, but I mean, it's no longer. Whereas 6 months ago, I would say, they're overly concerned about 4 congresswomen. It's not just 4 congresswomen anymore. I mean, I think one of the most significant things you had this week was Gregory Meeks, who replaced Elliot Engel when Elliot Engel was ousted by a squad member last year in a primary. He replaced Elliot Engel as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, and so it was. Where there was jockeying to be the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and it was down to Joaquin Castro, I forget, or I think it's Joaquin Castro, and to Brad Sherman, who's very traditionally pro-Israel, and Gregory Meeks, and of course it's leadership who decides, but it's it's Nancy Pelosi who essentially decides who gets the chairmanship, and there's a vote within the caucus. But there is a look at the various interest groups that have, and they all audition, and it is what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to get around to say. They all audition. They audition for J Street, which is all for pressure on Israel. And they audition for Democratic Majority for Israel, which is not for any kind of pressure for Israel. And those groups invited reporters to listen in on those auditions.
By auditions, you mean like the candidate, the people who want to be chairman of the committee will come talk to these groups, and the groups will. Okay.
Yeah. So it was all on Zoom, and it was done. I think DMFI, the kind of traditionally pro-Israel kind of AIPAC-aligned group, allowed reporters to listen all 3. J Street allowed them into 1, and Gregory Meeks was like, assistance to Israel is unassailable, as was Brad Sherman. Castro was a little more equivocal on that. But Gregory Meeks got it, and he said that assistance to Israel was unassailable. And then this week, he was all set to write a letter to the State Department saying, can you delay this transfer of $735 million worth of precision-guided missiles for about a week they're not due to arrive for another year, but he just wanted the whole process delayed for a week while we have a chance to look at it. And in the end, he withdrew the letter, but he withdrew it because he said that we have got now, because we've raised this kerfuffle, we've actually got the Biden administration saying they're going to give us more oversight of this. They're going to send people over to us to talk about it. But Israel, and every other, he made it clear, every other recipient of U.S. military aid, ally or not ally, whatever, but Israel and everybody else should know that we are going to be looking at this more closely from now on. And now Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is trying to move a joint resolution that would actually stop the transfer. I don't think she's going to get anywhere with that. But just the fact of Meeks 6 months ago saying assistance to Israel is unassailable, and now saying, you know what, we want to take a second look. That's a big deal. And it's something that Israelis are noticing.
And what forces do you think he's responding to? What was he seeing, feeling? Who was he hearing from? And I know it's probably a guess largely, but why do you think he at least hesitated?
I think that he's just seeing that, he's seeing American public opinion is among Democrats is, they see the image of what's going on, in Gaza, and whether, we can have a separate philosophical discussion as to what's justified or not, but they see that they're questioning why American material is being used to carry out those operations. And I think that the grassroots, the pro-Palestinian grassroots or the Palestinian sympathetic grassroots has become more pronounced. I think it becomes much more difficult in a post-police brutality environment, Black Lives Matter environment, to countenance that kind of imagery. And I will be the first to argue that they're two completely different things, not necessarily morally, but just tactically, they're completely different things. But imagery is imagery. It's what sticks in your head. And when you see a police action have a terrible effect on civilians, and you're sensitized to that, and Americans have become much more sensitized to that in the last, ever since George Floyd and before George Floyd, frankly, going back to Ferguson in 2015. And he's a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, and there'll be those sensibilities as well at play. So I think that all that comes into it, and that helps that helps bring about the shift. And not just with Gregory Meeks, you see it with the entire party. I mean, and the other thing, Israelis don't pay attention to this, I think they should, is you've got 25 Jewish Democrats in the House. 12 of them signed a letter saying there should be an immediate ceasefire. And everybody starts these letters by saying Hamas's attacks are completely unconscionable, blah, blah, blah. But then they get to the part where they say that Israel's reactions have been causing a lot of devastation and there has to be an immediate ceasefire. And so 12 Jewish members out of 25 Democrats in the House are saying that. And John Ossoff, who's Jewish from Georgia, is leading a letter from 28 Democrats overall in the Senate saying the same thing. And, the significance of 12 in the House is they're saying as Jewish members. They actually start like that, as Jewish lawmakers. And they're saying that. And I think that gives somebody like Gregory Meeks a license to say, because that's how Congress works. It's interest-based. If you always go to, the first people you go to, the big crisis for this is AIPAC, I think, because the first, any lobby, the first lawmakers they always come to are the ones that share their interests. So, if you're a coal miner, if you run a coal mine, you're going to go to the lawmakers from West Virginia. If you're AIPAC, you're going to go to the Jewish lawmakers. And now 12 of the 25 Democrats in the House are saying, we're not listening. That's a whole separate crisis. It's going to be interesting for the pro-Israel community. That's interesting that Israelis aren't necessarily aware of, but they are definitely aware that they are losing
it's
Democrats.
Funny. I mean, I was kind of feeling unconvinced that anything fundamental has changed in American politics. And I mean, so for example, when Meeks wound up not really putting a hold on the arms transfer, I took that as a sign that maybe he'd felt a little pressure from the other side and kind of wanted to get out of the thing, and he could claim that Biden said something or other. Also, I mean, Biden himself has, now you could argue that he's just a little slow on the uptake or something, but he certainly didn't early on seem to put much pressure on Netanyahu. Now, he did have the, Rashida Tlaib had a kind of, I guess, showdown with him. I mean, they had a very passionate discussion for a few minutes. She has a grandmother, I think, who lives in the West Bank, and it was after that, I don't know if coincidentally, that he seemed to take a harder line with Netanyahu, and I don't know how far it got him. I mean, judging by today's reporting, so his people let it be known that he had told Bibi he expects de-escalation today, and then Bibi's people let it be known that Bibi will do whatever the hell he wants to do, as I understand today's reporting, right?
Right.
So I don't see the Biden administration terribly fearful of some kind of new progressive energy that's skeptical of Israel or anything. And in any event, I don't see him succeeding in having much influence on Bibi. What's your take on that?
I think first of all, don't discount Biden's personal involvement. I mean, he may be the president personally who's most invested in the pro-Israel cause over the years. I mean, much more than Donald Trump. Donald Trump, you could say, even came by it opportunistically to a degree. He wasn't even aware of it until he became, he was elected president. He wasn't that aware of it. Biden has been around since, was elected in 1972. I think his first foreign trip was to Israel on the eve of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. He has an encounter with Golda Meir that he loves to talk about, in which he's just deeply, deeply emotionally invested in the whole thing, etc. A lot of his most important donors are people who've been most loyal to him. Michael Adler, a Florida guy, who backed his 1988 presidency. I think he was his campaign finance chair, was certainly, instrumental in his 2008 and his 2020 runs. Is much part of the pro-Israel community. So I think that's part of it. That helps feed it. Also, just not wanting to be caught up in the sort of the way that Obama was ended up depicted as kind of insensitive, even though there was a lot of things that Obama did that were very pro-Israel.
Iron Dome,
absolutely. He initiated funding of Iron Dome. It didn't come from Congress first. It came from the executive branch, so he just doesn't want to have that stigma. He's treading very carefully there. And frankly, I think that, this is Chinatown for this gang. They don't want to go back there. If you talk to individuals, with a couple of exceptions, but if you talk to individuals, people, the same people who were involved in the two efforts by the Obama administration to bring out Israeli-Palestinian peace, the same individuals in 2009 and 2013-14, 2009-10, they were burned. Before this happened, they said we just don't want to deal with it. If it happens,
by they you mean a number of people now in the Biden administration?
Yeah.
What, Blinken, Sullivan, what?
Well, I don't know, but I think probably
Kerry certainly, but
I think that these, if you talk to people a little lower down, you're getting like this, or even like their equivalents, and probably them as well. I think Jake Sullivan for sure, and I haven't spoken to him, but I would get the impression they didn't want to deal with this. If it happened organically, if it came up, that's how the biggest success of Middle Eastern peace worked. 1979, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin started talking to one another, and then they went to Carter and they said, "We've got these gaps. Can you wrap them up?" And Carter came in, and I'm making it sound a lot easier than it was. But he produced the most long-lasting, successful peace in the Middle East by doing that. And so that's what they wanted. They said, when you're ready, come back to us and we'll help you bridge the gaps. And you're probably not going to be ready for a long time because Abbas and Netanyahu definitely weren't ready. But now they're dragged back into it. So I think that has a lot, they're feeling their way into how to solve this issue. So I think that's accounts for the hesitancy. I don't think, in terms of feeling any pressure from the left, from progressives, I don't know if Biden's really feeling that yet. I mean, he's like, he has had a kind of honeymoon with progressives because they see him as so surprising on, as it's like all these domestic fronts, including, the stimulus package, trying to get, the child credit, made permanent, that all those kinds of things, and so they're kind of willing to forgive him on things that he's not as accelerated on. And the other thing that's interesting about if you watch progressives, they say if you bring pressure on Biden, he'll eventually change his mind. The most famous case of that is the refugees. He finally returned to his promise on the refugees. So they could also maybe holding back some of the pressure because they want, they're thinking that maybe he'll eventually come around on this in any case. But, yeah, that's
so to get back to the way this feeds back on Israeli opinion, do you think this makes them worry more about the cost, the political cost to them of sustaining the conflict right now, and perhaps if they have the choice down the road of having another conflict?
I think definitely, like I said, on the talking head level, absolutely. I mean, there was this whole controversy over confirming Colin Cowell. It's weird how Senate confirmations become proxy battles for all these ideological things that don't really have anything to do with the individual being confirmed. Colin Cowell is a fairly pro-Israel character who helped shepherd through Iron Dome, but because he became identified with the Iran deal, you had all these conservatives trying to kill him. You had all these progressives defending him, and what was interesting is that 3 generals who worked with Colin Cowell when he was working for Obama reached out to me. And they said, we don't see anything wrong with Colin Cowell. In fact, he's somebody who's been,
And let's be clear. This is Colin, Kahl. It sounds a little like Colin Powell.
Right. Sorry.
Different guy, who worked on, I guess, the Iran deal. And, did he wind up, did he make it into the Biden?
He's in.
He was confirmed. Okay. So he was in. He was controversial. He took pressure from the right. So he's now in the Pentagon, right?
He's in. And the 3 Israeli generals, I mean, they talked to me about their personal interactions with Colin Cowell, whom they all liked, and they all said was a good listener. That was their takeaway. But the other undercurrent, and they all brought up, was like, why are we pissing off the Biden administration? He's the president, if he was, what was unspoken is like, if he was introducing somebody who was truly toxic, maybe that would be a reason to speak up. But why are supposed friends, the pro-Israel community in the States, why are they invested in alienating this guy who we actually can work with? Mm-hmm. And so that mentality, that's that. And I think that mentality, could manifest certainly in how, in dealing with the Biden administration. Now, so Netanyahu can say all he wants, we're going to do as much as we want, but let's see what happens on Thursday. I think that there's already talk of a winding down. Netanyahu could say, like, I told Biden off or whatever, but quietly wind things down because he wants to extricate from this. On the other hand, I have to say that Netanyahu is probably maybe the one person who, he said it out loud that he thinks that he's capable of manipulating American public opinion. He isn't, but he's kind of deluded himself into thinking he is. So, I don't know if he has that reaction.
He was caught on video saying that to some settlers when I don't think he knew he was being videoed. Basically saying he can get America to do anything he wants. This was a long time ago.
Right. But he still believes it, even after that came out, and he was ridiculed for it because that's the exact mentality was behind his 2015 speech to Congress, criticizing Obama's Iran policy, which was catastrophic for the relationship with Democrats. I think that is a pivotal moment that Netanyahu began to lose Democrats.
Yeah. So it does matter. It registers on Israeli public opinion, I gather, both kind of popular opinion and elite opinion, when America's support seems to be slipping. I'm wondering if that's kind of a separate issue in their minds from what the rest of the world thinks of them. Sometimes, tell me if this is too simple a model. Sometimes I think a lot of people in Israel think, look, as far as Europe's opinion of us, the world's opinion of us, they're always going to hate us. And we got to do what we got to do. Got to mow the lawn every once in a while. And the premise behind that is kind of Palestinians are always going to hate us, right? There's never going to, we shouldn't invest too much in trying to fine tune their opinion of us, because in the long run, that's a long shot. You got to assume they'll hate us. Most of the world will hate us. So we do what we have to do militarily, regardless of how it seems to register on world opinion. But America, but this relative indifference to world opinion is related to a dependence on American opinion, right? In other words, we've always got America, and tell me that must be too simple a model But tell me in what ways it's too simple a model of how Israel processes this stuff.
I think it's not too simple a model. I think that's a big part of it. I think absolutely. I would say two things. I think that Israelis, and I wrote this on Twitter the other day, I think structurally they are ready for a world in which nobody likes them. They used to they used to joke in the 80s, like they used to criticize each other, saying, what you're doing is going to isolate us so much we're going to be Albania. And that was not the nice welcoming country that I can tell you Albania is right now, because I've been there. But that was because I really don't want to offend Albanians. That was the country of Enver Hoxha, who was like one of the most isolating leaders of the world. Why do you want us to become Albania? But underwriting that claim, like, don't let us become Albania, was actually we're capable of, worst comes to worst, absolute direst scenario, we can be Albania.
We'll survive.
So there's that, even like if they lose America. And the other thing is, like, I think that there's also, they say that, as long as we have America, we're okay, but they're also thrilled when they get friendly, they get love from other parts of the world. You saw that with the Abraham Accords last year with, the people flooding Dubai after the relations were opened between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. You see that in like their eagerness to win the Eurovision Song Contest, because that's really a country popularity thing, and they get very excited about that. You saw that in the 70s when like Miss Israel became Miss Universe or something. I think Miss World or Miss Universe, whichever one it was. And so there's that as well. I think that there's like, everybody wants to be loved, even if you can be Albania, even if you're capable of being Albania, you want to be loved. And so there's that. So they're not entirely immune to that. And the other factor is that, America's fine. Having America is great. But in terms of trade, you want Europe. They're just across the Mediterranean. They're right next door. And that's what's fantastic about. And that's one thing that, Netanyahu is, in terms of being a successful leader of his country, he deserves credit for. He's actually expanded a lot of trade opportunities for Israel in Africa, countries where Israel can easily, Israeli companies can easily reach. And you can see the Abraham Accords in the 4 countries that have been affected in those terms as well, commercial opportunities. And so obviously Israelis, like any other people, they care about that as well. They want easy and accessible markets.
But if just to focus on the Palestinian part of opinion, if their view is that like Palestinian hatred of them is kind of a universal constant, right? Like there's no point in thinking seriously about engineering a fundamental change in attitude. If that's the belief, and again, I'm kind of caricaturing it, but to the extent that that's the belief, things just don't seem to look bright for any kind of long-term actual resolution of that problem, right? Because, honestly, it's not that easy to envision one anyway, right?
Right.
Because with more and more settlements in the West Bank, interconnected by these highways and the shifts in politics in Israel and so on, a 2-state solution seems to more and more people too remote to take seriously. And then, of course, a 1-state solution, I think Israel is nowhere near contemplating.
Right.
So, am I right there that leave aside Palestinian opinion, and there are issues there as well, but just in terms of current Israeli opinion about Palestinian opinion, does that itself make resolution anytime soon implausible, or even really appreciable movement toward resolution?
I think it's split. I think, you saw during the Oslo process an acceptance of the idea that the Palestinians might want to coexist, that, like I said, diminished certainly during the Second Intifada. The Israelis don't necessarily distinguish so much between Israeli Arab and Palestinians. And so that might be shifting in the sense that there absolutely persists. You're right. This idea that they'll never accommodate us. We always have to have some degree of control over them because Netanyahu says that he could never give up security control over the West Bank for exactly that reason. He cannot trust the Palestinians to be a buffer against a threat from the East. So there absolutely is that attitude. I don't know how pervasive it is. I don't know how pervasive it remains. One of the one of the most interesting things I saw from recently is you saw, not only did you see Jews joining in this massive action yesterday, not only did you see, have you seen Jews and Arabs going out to intersections and holding hands and being part of that?
No, wait, what massive action are you talking about yesterday?
The Palestinian strike, the cross Palestine.
Oh, you saw Jews joining hands with them in some sense.
You're right. You saw like Israel has three major cellular phone outlets. One's called Cellcom, and they struck for an hour. Management organized a strike to express solidarity with Israeli Arabs.
These are Jews who
a Jewish-owned company, Jewish employers. I'm sure also Arab-Israeli employers. It's an interesting thing to see in the corporate sector. It's an interesting thing to see, among the employees, the Jewish employees who also backed it. I think that I think it becomes harder and harder, like once you think about this long term, not to imagine some kind of accommodation with the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. And it's, eventually it's going to circle back to that, in a given moment, not accommodating the Palestinians might seem the most realistic thing, like when they're shooting rockets at you. And then in another given moment, accommodating them when you're contemplating that period over when they were shooting rockets at you and you're wondering, how can I prevent that from happening? And how can I raise my children not to have to worry about that? Then it becomes the more realistic thing is to listen to them and to accommodate them. And I don't know that isn't on the cards. It'll never be on the cards for all Israelis, for sure. I don't know if it's not on the cards for the majority of Jewish Israelis and Israelis further down the line, because it has been in the past.
And so I guess there's two ways people in Israel could process what's going on now, by which I mean both the civil strife within Israel and, of course, the thing with Hamas. And for that matter, there's been unrest in the West Bank that has led to some deaths in the West Bank. And I guess the two ways they could process all of this is accommodation looks even less plausible than before, or accommodation looks even more imperative than before. Exactly. And I guess it's unclear to you what the net effect of this current round is in those terms, whether it's going to add momentum to accommodation within Israel or reduce momentum. It's too soon to say, or what?
Yeah, it's hard to say. Like I said, there are classes of Israelis that are very outward looking, and they're very aware of how these things play out. I don't know if it's like the metric you want to use, you and I, but Gal Gadot, Wonder Woman, the Israeli actress who plays Wonder Woman, in 2014, before she was Wonder Woman, but she was already like in movies and a model and beautiful and famous, put up something on Instagram about standing with the IDF, and she got really criticized for that, and it's been held against her since then by pro-Palestinians. And then look at what she put on Instagram more recently, that she just wants a solution. She wants something that's going to make mothers on both sides not fear for their children, or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. That's an interesting kind of metric if you look at it, that kind of migration. And there are a lot of other Israelis who want to, who see opportunities for interaction, who want those interactions, and who also, I think, genuinely, they feel the concerns. I mean, there's a weird sort of interesting split now where, like, the NGOs that organize for coexistence are under fire from the right in Israel, but they're also getting, I think there's a lot of grassroots support for them from other sectors. So you had. There was this thing where locally elected officials, both Jewish and Arab, called for their leaders to speak out against violence against the other side. And it wasn't just, people on the left. It was across the board. And that's because they were feeling pressure from certain people within their grassroots who are dealing with coexistence, which is interesting. So it could go either way.
Okay. Well, let's end on a note of hope then. I appreciate you taking the time. I know your son's just home from college and you want to go out and have a dinner. And I believe maybe today is the official day on which the mask guidance changes, or there's some day in which today is a day of pandemic liberation or something. I think. But anyway, I know that ultimately local rules govern here, so I encourage you to abide by those. But enjoy the dinner, and thanks so much for taking the time, Ron.
Thanks, Robert.